Good morning, and welcome to the Symposium to celebrate 10 years of important policy research produced by the scholars at CWED, the Center for Wage and Employment Dynamics housed at Early, the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment. My name is Sandra Susan Smith. I am professor of sociology here at Berkeley. I am also Early's interim director. Since its inception, CWED's mission has been to conduct policy research of academic rigor that highlights and explicates important trends in wages in employment and in contemporary labor markets. As a member of the UC Berkeley community, I had become increasingly impressed by the tremendous impact that CWED has had on important topics of the day. It is that very impact that inspired me to propose the idea for today's symposium, which is co-sponsored by CWED, Early, and the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Evidence of CWED's impact has come in many forms. First is the output of such a tiny research shop. Although CWED has become very well known because of its research on minimum wage impacts and innovative methods that push the envelope in terms of what we can say about the causal effect of wage increases, CWED scholars write on a range of timely and relevant topics of the day, including health insurance and health policy, immigration, labor relations and productivity, tipped worker labor markets, the transformation of retail labor markets, worker turnover and job training, and models of low-wage work. Further, their findings have been reported in dozens of publications. Roughly 20 articles and edited and book chapters have been published in refereed journals and edited volumes, including Industrial and Labor Relations Review, the Journal of Labor Economics, the Journal of Labor Issues, and Industrial Relations. By my count, CWED scholars have also produced some 25 policy briefs stressing the impact on workers of the changing economic landscape. The second tangible evidence of CWED's impact can also be seen in how often its scholars are sought out for technical assistance, especially in estimating the effects of local minimum and sub-minimum wage increases. Over a dozen organizations have done so, including the City of San Jose, the New York State Senate, the City of Seattle, and organizations in Maine, Arizona, Kentucky, and elsewhere. CWED scholars' perspectives and research findings are often reported in the media, including print, radio, and television, and by influential economists and policy analysts who blog. In the last 2 years alone, CWED has been mentioned roughly 36 times in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, Bloomberg Politics, the San Francisco Chronicle, and other local news outlets, just to name a few. Since 2007, its scholars have made over 75 radio and television appearances and have been quoted in the press well over 100 times. Finally, the high quality and impact of CWED's work has been noted by the country's most esteemed and influential economists. To illustrate a few noteworthy quotes, many of you which you are seeing here. Jared Bernstein from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who is here today, writes, "As someone who has long been engaged in this debate, I assure you, it is extremely hard to make a muscular, fact-based argument about the impact of minimum wage changes without citing the work of CWED."
That's true.
Berkeley's own Emmanuel Sayez writes, CWED has played a key role in the debate about minimum wage policies. CWED research papers have systematically used recent variation in minimum wages across states and cities to provide the best credible evidence of the effects on employment. While the debate continues, the view that minimum wages do not adversely affect employment is gaining ground thanks to the CWED rich body of empirical research. CWED is a great asset for UC Berkeley. Harvard economist Larry Katz notes, as do co-authors David Card and Alan Kruger, that CWED's key minimum wage publications are among the most innovative recent studies offering the best and most convincing evidence in recent years. Last but not least, Heather Boucher from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth writes, CWED's 10th anniversary is an auspicious occasion for all who care about working families, a strong economy, and evidence-based policy. There is continuing need for research that helps us to understand how best to provide minimum wage that supports workers and their families and contributes to a strong economy. Your research on minimum wages has been a critical element in the ongoing national debate over the issue. Now, to achieve what CWED has this past decade has required vision, hard work and determination, and know-how, not just of its co-chairs, but also of the extended CWED family. CWED's current postdoctoral fellows include Anna Bedoy and Carl Nadler, and it counts among its research affiliates Arindrajit Dube, assistant professor at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Brian Phelan, assistant professor of economics at DePaul University, Claire Montelou, research economist at Stanford, Rachel West, associate director of poverty and prosperity program at the Center for American Progress, and Ben Zipperer, research economist at Washington Center for Equitable Growth. There would be no convening today if it were not for these and other scholars that I've mentioned contributing what they have over the years. But the co-chairs deserve so much attention and credit for the vision that they have realized and that we hope will continue in some form well into the next 10 years and beyond. Allow me to introduce them. Michael Reich is Professor Emeritus of Economics and the former director of Early. He is a giant in the field of labor economics, and with over 150 scholarly articles, papers, and presentations, and over 17 books and monographs. There are just too many words to list here, so I'm just going to move on. But as impressive as CWED has been in terms of its impact on key debates, what's extraordinary to me to note is that it will represent just one of Michael's lasting legacies. Michael, I've been a fan of your work for well before I arrived at Berkeley 13 years ago, and it's an honor to be able to introduce you today. Sylvia Allegretto came to economics a bit later in life, as she told us last night, but has wasted no time in establishing an impressive reputation for doing high-quality research on important topics of the day. Sylvia has 4 publications, including 4 books on the impact of the changing economic landscape on workers and their families, with a particular interest in workers in sub-minimum wage labor markets and teacher gaps in pay. In my discipline, public sociologists, those who translate sociological concepts and insights to and for the broader public, often achieve special acclaim. To my mind, Sylvia is also a public economist of first order, with a special talent for debunking pervasive myths about how the economy works in terms that are both accessible and that resonate beyond the ivory tower. Over these past few months, it has been one of my greatest pleasures to get to know and learn from this woman of impressive skill, deep insights, and broad talents. Although others have also contributed to CWED's conception and inception, CWED's 10 years is in good part attributable to what these 2 outstanding individuals have brought to the table. For this, they deserve our deep respect and admiration. But before I turn the spotlight on Sylvia and Michael, I would like to take a moment to thank Early Central staff for all the work that they have done to make this event possible today. Sarah Hinckley, Barb Campbell, Charlotte Ruddy, Megan Collins, Janice Kimball, Jackie Sullivan, Rocio Camacho, are all responsible for all that has gone right so far, especially in getting folks here and to dinner last night, and all that will likely go perfectly throughout the day. We owe them our gratitude. Michael, the floor is yours.
No, Sylvia's going over.
Is Sylvia going? Well, Sylvia, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you all for coming. Yeah, I want to reiterate, this was, it was almost like a last-minute thing. Sandra came, she stepped in to take the directorship of the Institute while Jesse has stepped aside on sabbatical. We had a meeting. She asked, how long have you been here? I'm like, 10 years. We started CWED 10 years ago. That was lunch, went back to my desk, an email comes flying in. Are you having any marker for are you and Michael doing anything? I'm like, no, we didn't even, it's never even dawned on us. Next thing you know, well, here we are. So it's fantastic. I also want to say the staff, just tremendous. It was a lot of work, so thank you very much. And it's great to see people who used to work here being so successful, like Rachel West, now at the Center for American Progress. She was my GSR when she was here. You know, Claire's back. She's worked with CWED. And of course, much of what we do has been driven by one of the co-founders. There were 3 co-founders, Arindrajit Dube and Michael and I. And of course, much of what we do is coming out of his generosity and genius. And, you know, now we have a lot of other folks coming into the family like Ben Zipperer. And, but it's also, I want to just give a special shout out to my homies from EPI. My only other job as an economist, Jared Bernstein, Larry Michel, who's stepping down after 15 years at the end of this month as president of the Economic Policy Institute. He's been there for over 30 years. Jared also spent, I think, about 17 years at EPI. So it's really special for me to be here with these guys. So I'm just gonna, and I wanted to point out too, talk about a small shop. We've got 4 people and 2 of them are part-time. That's CWED now. And but Carl Nadler is tremendous. He also was my GSR when he was a student here. He left for 1 year and was making a bunch of money across the bay, and I somehow convinced him to come and take a postdoc. So I'm not sure what they says about his economics calculated. Yeah. And then Anna Goudet in the back from Norway, tremendous researchers and making tremendous contributions, and will so in the future. Michael? Oh, and also, yeah, working with Michael. You know, we've been partners now for 10 years, and it's been a real honor because, you know, I've learned so much from all that he's known through all these decades of being here. So let me hand it over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Sandra and Sylvia, for all those overstatements. You know. I wanted to go second so we could go more smoothly into the first panel, which I'm chairing anyway. And what can I say? This is a marvelous event. I never expected to have anything like this. So thank you, Sandra, for the idea, and everyone else for who supported it and worked on it, and for all your work. I was going to talk about how I got into this topic, but my wife said no. Don't start with your childhood, you know, or the fact that my father worked his way up with the help of the union in a very low-wage industry, the garment district in New York, and eventually became an employer, or my participation in the Civil Rights March in 1963, or any of that sort. Instead, I do want to add to all these statements one that we got from Heidi Hartman, which I have, but we just didn't get into the slides. Heidi Hartman is the founder of the Institute for Women's Policy Research and a big cheese in DC. And she writes, the work of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics on the role of minimum wage laws is highly regarded by policymakers, researchers, and advocates. Center researchers testify frequently, author peer-reviewed articles in top journals, and stay in touch with advocates in order to understand the state of debate and action on the ground. The Center's rigorous work has helped change the terms of debate on the minimum wage, with increasing recognition that the benefits of increasing low wages far outweigh any negatives. I mean, I think that's, you know, we can go home now, right? You know, as Heidi put it, as always, so well. And I do want to promise everybody that this is going to be a really sparkling day, because I brought some sparklers. So here they are. And we're going to put this in something later in the day. And watch out, because, you know, this thing, I can't get there. Okay. So actually, I started working on low-wage labor markets as a graduate student, first-year graduate student, 50 years ago, exactly, working for Mike Puri and Peter Doringer, and with the late David Gordon, and we came up with a theory, some of us, of dual labor markets, that the low-wage labor market was different from other labor markets, particularly in having high turnover and being kind of dead-end jobs. And I guess I've been writing the same paper ever since, except I've turned from what the diagnosis is to the solution with the minimum wages. And the origins of CWED really go back farther than 10 years, when Ken Jacobs and other people enticed me, I guess, bribed me or something, to work on living wage policy in San Francisco at the end of the 20th century. And as you'll see later, we not only did we get Ken to become one of our best people here at the Institute and at the Labor Center, but we also put out, I think, a very influential paper on living wages in California, but also living wages at the San Francisco airport, which was a leader. And that work led very soon to a request from the president of the Board of Supervisors, excuse me, I'm blanking, what is his name? Matt Gonzalez, who was in the paper recently as a public defender in a very high-profile case. But he was then very much for raising the minimum wage in San Francisco, to have a citywide minimum wage, not one with a lot of exemptions like Santa Fe or DC had at the time. And it was his vision that led us to first to do a prospective study of San Francisco, and then to get it through on the ballot, one with, I think, 63% of the vote or something. The Restaurant Association was neutral on the subject, and then competing candidate for mayor, Gavin Newsom, was also pro the minimum wage, so there was really no opposition. And it was a tremendous victory. We then, with Aaron Dube's help and Suresh Schneider, did a post-study with all kinds of controls, and we found that, in fact, the minimum wage did raise pay, improve job quality, and did not have an adverse effect on employment. And some other people, I think, looked at how many people got pay increases, and it came in very close to what we had predicted in the prospective paper. And so then it's been kind of downhill ever since. Now we've been on the same track. We had the idea to generalize from one case study of San Francisco, plus the Carden-Kruger case study of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and that really got us going in terms of national research. And then, it was really clear that we needed to institutionalize ourselves within the Institute, because I could funnel a lot of money to this work as the director, but that wasn't going to last forever. And so we created the Center for Wage and Employment Dynamics to be a home for kind of rigorous academic research. And yes, Sylvia and Aaron were our members then. We had Annetta Bernhardt for a while. And now we have all these wonderful affiliates and alumni. So anyway, thank you for coming and hearing what we have to say today. Okay. Yeah, you can pass. Okay, so why don't we get going on the first panel, which is a really distinguished panel in my mind. Aaron's going to talk. We've already kind of heard who Aaron is. Was our postdoc and then research economist for quite a few years during this period, and then he had to leave. It was our loss, his gain, for the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, where he's continued to put out amazing work, some with us as co-authors and some with other co-authors and papers of his own on minimum wage and many other topics. And he's going to talk about some of the achievements that we have generated in the minimum wage literature, particularly the idea that we have to look at close-by comparisons. When we have especially when we have lots of cases, we can do a lot of close-by comparisons in order to make sure that there are that we're not picking up other effects when we do employment effect studies of minimum wages. And then Sylvia, who's also been well introduced, is going to talk about the study that we have underway together with our postdocs Carl and Anna to look at very high minimum wages, the kind that, of course, everybody here knows about, that are going up to $15 in many cities and in many states. And we have results from 6 cities, and we're going to use a different method there, which is we're going to say, at least for these cities, which are individual case studies, we don't have hundreds of case studies and events, that a better method, it looks like, is to use something called synthetic controls. And we don't stop there, because Aaron and Ben and co-authors, Attila Lindner, a Berkeley student, PhD, and Daruk Chandish, have created still another new method that goes beyond synthetic controls, which I refer to as the bunching estimator, So we're going to hear about all three of those in this panel. The speakers have about 15 minutes each, which I will enforce. And then the discussants are going to be Laura, right, Giuliano, from UC Merced, but also one of our former research assistants here, and Berkeley PhD, and distinguished author of many scholarly publications, and Ian Perry. I think I saw Ian. Yeah, there you are. Ian just finished his master's at the Goldman School of Public Policy and has gone to work again for the Labor Center, and he has just put out an incredible study of California, what he calls the California policy model, and he'll tell us a little about that as part of his comments. Okay, so first speaker is Aaron, and you're on.
Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thanks for organizing this. As you have heard a little bit already, it's been a real honor and a privilege to work with folks at CWED. Sylvia, Michael, and I started CWED 10 years ago, and I just looking back, it's one of my time here at Berkeley generally and with CWED was a transformative part of my intellectual development and helped shape research agenda that is ongoing. And so it's really great to have this event where it gives us a chance to pause and reflect on some of the things we've done. And so what I'm going to try to do is to give a sense of where we were when we began some of this research. That'll be kind of my abbreviated history of minimum wage research in thinking about methodological issues of how to construct reliable or credible control groups, and what some of the findings were, what some likely impact of that research was, as well as some of the criticisms and pushbacks on this, because it has to be said that this is a lively area of research with ongoing disagreements, and it's useful to understand some of the sources of those disagreements, and I'll try to give you a flavor of that in the time that I have. And I'll just give a little bit of what I see as future directions in minimum wage research. So with that, let me give you the very abbreviated multi-decadal history of minimum wage research. So there used to be the bad old days before, when people used to do time series analysis, looking at what happened when the federal minimum wage rose, and what happened to teen employment in the U.S. Not really bad old days, but it was really limited set of evidence in the 70s and 80s, and evidence that turned out to be fragile. In part, it was driven by necessity, though, because there wasn't a lot of variation across different states in minimum wages until the late 80s and the 90s, and that led to what's sometimes called the new minimum wage research. There's been many new minimum wage research generations at this point. That was the first new minimum wage research. And that led to using variation across states by, Newmark and Washer, also by David Card in his 1992 paper in different ways. But underlying, there's always this issue, are these states? So the good news is we have more variation. The potentially bad news is maybe these states are not all similar. Are they following parallel trends? These are things that today's applied microeconomists just naturally ask. They're not necessarily questions that were being asked in the same systematic way, at least in this literature back in the day. Just to give you a sense of some of the issues of why states raising the minimum wage in the last several decades are not necessarily like the ones that are not. Here's an example. Here's a map of the states that voted for Barack Obama. Actually, no, here's a state of maps that actually have high minimum wages. As you can see, they're the same. So they're highly clustered, certainly geographically, but also in many other dimensions, in politics, I mentioned, unionization, sectoral mix, and some of the cyclical factors. So you may worry that there's a lot of things going on, and you may worry that these states are not all necessarily on parallel trends. And so there are many different ways of dealing with it. One of the early ways of dealing with it was by, David Card and Alan Kruger leveraging proximity. So proximity by looking at places that are nearby, like New Jersey and Pennsylvania. New Jersey increases the minimum wage Pennsylvania does not. Let's see what happens. In their first paper, arguably the most well-known paper in minimum wage research at this point, looked at what happened to New Jersey and Pennsylvania using self-collected survey. In their reanalysis, they used representative data from unemployment insurance payrolls to redo the analysis. That will be an important thing I'll come back to in terms of the data, and found that there were no effect on jobs in the restaurant sector when the minimum wage rose in New Jersey, and then the reverse experiment when the federal minimum wage rose, affecting Pennsylvania, but not New Jersey. So, but at the same time, this was a controversial area. So there was Carter and Kruger, and then there was papers, numerous papers by Newmark and Washer, both using their analysis of this data, which I think ended up being problematic for a variety of reasons, but then also looking at sort of a broader panel analysis of minimum wages, and there were contradictory findings. So here we are in sort of mid-2000s. I think there was a bit of a stalemate, if you will, and there was not clear what the next, I'm skipping over other contributions and not to slight them, but just to give a sense of where I saw us being in terms of the literature. And there's the individual case studies, like, for example, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Then Michael, Suresh Naidu, and I did our case study of San Francisco. And then there was this style of looking at panels of states, and those results sometimes tended to give different answers. And is it because the states are really different, or is it something else is going on? And so there's this great quote from Charlie Brown, a well-known labor economist, in the Handbook of Labor Economics in 1999, reviewing minimum wage literature, pointing out that it is important to remember that whatever happened in Texas and New Jersey — Texas was another study by Larry Katz and Alan Kruger for minimum wage in restaurants — they're just two data points. And again, in principle, these UI data, ES 202, now called QCW, data could be exploited to pool several such state-based experiments. So he wrote that in 1999, and you have to understand that there was no public use data, QCW data, available quite at that time, but subsequently that became available, and that's something that we leveraged to study and pool many of these experiments. And this was what we did, and this was what I did with Michael Reich, as well as Bill Lester, who also worked here at RLE, and he was a graduate student, and in a set of several papers. And one of the things we did, leveraging proximity, like I mentioned, is to compare states that happen to be on the other side of the border. Okay, sorry, I have a random message here. This, I guess I'm just going to remind me tomorrow. I don't know what that means, but okay. Looking at states across looking at counties across state borders with different minimum wages, but pooling over several decades, or at least 15 years of data. Again, going beyond those individual case study, but embedding that in the same kind of analysis as, for example, was being done by Newmark and Washer studying teen employment, for instance. And here's a map that gives you a flavor of what was the kind of variation we're using. Here are all the border counties. In red are the ones with some minimum wage difference over the period. So you'll see that, again, we were studying, this is in sort of late 2007 or later, that we were conducting this analysis. So there's a lot of variation in minimum wages across states, including states that happen to be next to each other, so counties with different minimum wages. And what we found is, looking at two high impact groups that had been studied in the literature. So one set of studies have been looking at teens, and the reason people look at teens is not because economists really care about teens, but there's just a lot of them are minimum wage workers. So it's like the canary in the coal mine. If you're going to find something, you're going to find it for them, is kind of the argument. I'll have a little more to say about that, because I think that's also very limiting in some ways, and thankfully we're going beyond that in a variety of ways. And then the other is the restaurant sector as the kind of the most minimum wage intensive sector. So 24% of near minimum wage workers are in restaurants, and about the same fraction of restaurant workers are minimum wage, again, allowing you to more easily detect effects, whatever they may be. And here's what we found. We found that very clear evidence when looking across these counties, across state borders, one side raises the wage, one does not, minimum wage, one does not. The average earnings rise very clearly for these highly impacted groups. So for a 10% increase in minimum wage, average earnings rises by about 2%. At the same time, employment changes are very small. They're much smaller in percentage terms, for instance, than the earnings increases, usually not different from zero. At the same time, however, we also found that turnover in these jobs fell a lot. And that is interesting because both as it relates to helping understand what kind of labor market, how do labor markets work at the bottom of in the low-wage labor market work in terms of theories, as well as understanding some of the potentially offsetting productivity gains that may in part offset the cost increase to employers. At any rate, those are some of the key findings we had. And so I think, it is, I think it's safe to say, and it's sort of tooting your own horn, but I think it is safe to say that it has been an influential set of work that CWED has put out, and then I've been very privileged to be part of. I think both in terms of, if you look at citations or reactions, as you saw, from, eminent labor economists, or from this guy. Is a funny quick story. 2 hours or a few hours before the State of the Union address, I got an email from Larry Katz saying, heads up, the president's going to cite your research. I'm like, oh, okay. And so that was the enhanced version of the State of the Union address citing our border counties paper. But not all reactions were positive. So, for instance, David Newmark, along with Bill Washer and Ian Solis, wrote 2 papers sort of arguing that Dube, Lester, and Reich discard a great deal of valid identifying variation, throwing out the identifying baby along with, or worse yet, instead of the contaminated bathwater. So that's throwing away the baby instead of the bathwater was the argument. So what's the argument there? The main argument was that local area controls are not really good. They're bad. They throw away too much information. And that also that evidence is weak. Remember, I told you that the worry might be that those states that are raising minimum wages are not really in the same paths or not on parallel trends. And so their argument was, it's not clear that that's true. It's not clear that you have a problem that you need to solve. And if you are trying to solve it, your solution is bad. So, and then this proposed something else instead to do. But one of the interesting things is that if you look at, I mentioned we looked at 2 kind of high impact groups, restaurants and teens. The difference in the set of estimates when it comes to the restaurant sector has been very minimal. The literature, I think, mostly finds that employment effect, maybe is somewhat negative or somewhat positive or zero, but much smaller than the earnings effects. The main broader disagreement has been about teens. And here, whether or not teen employment is really negatively affected by the minimum wage is the central question. And the main argument that Newmark, Solis, and Washer made is that there's no clear evidence of violation of the parallel trends argument. So meaning there's no problem you need to solve. In a paper that I wrote with Sylvia, Michael, and Ben, I think we, in my view, pretty clearly showed there's a problem that needs to be solved. Here's a time path of teen employment using the model, assuming that everything is going parallel. At date 0, here is the minimum wage increase. And if you look at the data and you run the models using data from several decades, it's very clear that the years prior to the minimum wage increase, employment for teens was already much lower than you would expect. And in fact, much of the negative effect, if you use that model, accrued prior to the minimum wage increase. That's a problem. And so instead, if you use regional controls or trend controls, you find much better behavior in terms of those pre-existing trends. And that, for us, is a reason to look at this estimate and take that more seriously than that set of estimates. And if you look more generally, ask the question, are local controls good. We, I think, provide a variety of evidence that, in fact, neighboring areas are indeed much more similar. They are, in fact, better controls and deal with some of these problems. But, you know, they're not the only game in town, and certainly there's been increasing use of data-driven control groups that I think for, you know, the balance of the evidence has confirmed that at least for these cases, employment effect to date have been relatively small compared to earnings gains. And I think that has shown up in changes in opinions of economists and in survey evidence, for instance, whether or not most economists used to believe that minimum wages substantially lower employment among low-wage workers. That share has fallen a lot. Of course, that was then. This is now. Minimum wages have also been rising a lot, and that offers a new opportunity to understand better what they actually do. And here we are at early stages. And CWED has yet again played an important role in being part of that academic and policy discussion. Of course, we are at early stages of that, and there's conflicting evidence, and some of which we may hear about later today, about what these city minimum wages are actually doing. I expect to see a variety of methods and data that can be leveraged, and I think other case studies besides the Seattle one, which has been very controversial, will be very useful, be it Portland, Oregon, which something that I'm working on, in Minneapolis, and then there's the state level minimum wages in California and New York. I'm sure all of this will be studied, and so that makes it an exciting time to be doing minimum wage research, and I am positive that CWED will play a very important role in the coming years. So I'll stop here.
Well, continuing on with what where Aaron just left off, some new exciting research, we're going to have a series of policy briefs. So we have all of these new minimum wages, the newest local, some state, because California and New York are going to 15. But we have a bunch of cities that have signed on for new minimum wages. They're starting to phase them in. And so what we're doing in as real time as possible, we're going to try to analyze these phase-ins. So we have to wait for the phase-ins to occur, and then we have to wait for the data. We're going to use the QCW data that you mentioned, and we're going to be putting out a series of briefs. So we already put out one brief on Seattle. You might have heard about that. I'm not going to go into it. But this one is going to be our second brief that we're working on. This is very preliminary at this stage, but it's going to be a six-city brief. And this is, again, with my team. So we have all of these acronyms. So we have a new one now, AGNR. It doesn't flow as much as DLR or ADR, but, you know. I thought maybe when we had ADRZ, that was going to be like, oh, minimum wages, A through Z, we're done. But that's not the case. So here's three of the cities. They're located in California, as you can see. And these are not the whole policy. This is just what we're studying, right? So, for instance, these were some of the early adopters. Just huge minimum wage increases. I mean, there's San Jose was one of the first. At that time, was the biggest increase there was, both in dollar terms, $2. It was a 25% raise overnight. Then you can see San Francisco is indexing. That's what those jumps are in the early years before they had another policy change. And then Oakland went from 8 to 9. That was the California minimum wage increase. And then they quickly went from 9 to $12.25 overnight. So these were early adopters and some very large increases. And actually in California now we have over 20 local minimum wages in California. The other three cities included in this study are Chicago, DC, and Seattle. Again, Chicago's going to 13 in 2020. DC is going to 15, I think, in 2020. Seattle is going to 15 in, I think, 2021. For large firms without health coverage, they're already at 15. They started January of this year, but of course we don't have the data in yet. You have to get the data in and have enough lag time after the policy went in to study it. So we're not studying that jump, we're studying the ones that happened last year. So again, just to put it into context, these new local minimum wages, and some at the state level, are much higher than what we've seen historically. The blue line is, this is adjusted for price increases for the CPI. You have the federal minimum wage there in blue, and then here we just plotted the highest state minimum wage over time. And you see that we're going much higher than historical averages. So how are we going to look at this? Like Aaron suggested, there's all types of different methodologies that we're using. And so we do know that these kind of more localized estimators with big panels of data over decades, we've written a lot about this, that more localized estimates are better. But when you're talking about one-offs, when you're talking about these citywide policies, it's not necessarily the case that you can use nearby counties, for instance, as controls, as counterfactuals, because they often, in our case, they are failing the pre-existing trends assumption that we need. So this is not our paper, this is the body, but it's very clear, it's much cleaner than as a visual to kind of give you some intuition and motivation of what we're doing here. And so this is really cool because this is the California tobacco tax. It happened in about 1988. That was the first tax that there was. And so this is California per capita cigarette consumption. You can see it's kind of increasing, then it started decreasing, in the early 80s for other reasons. Even before the tax was implemented. So what are we going to do? Who should we compare this California's, who should we compare California's, per capita consumption of cigarettes to? And, the rest of the United States isn't a very good comparison because you can see the parallel trends assumption is violated here. You can see that in the U.S., even after California started to decline, that you see increases and then it kind of levels off in the U.S. So that's not going to work because they're moving differently prior to the increase. So the post-tax, post-treatment period, it's really impossible to say when they're both trending downward, what part of that trend had to do with the tax? What part was causal to the tax? So what Abadi did was say, let's use this synthetic control. So let's build a fake California. So we have this synthetic or fake California. We're going to take a weighted average, and this is a computer-generated process, right? You have all of this data. You hit a button, and it's really and you say, wow, the computer picks states, and they weight them accordingly to match as closely as possible the pre-trend in California. So the real California and the synthetic California are now moving together. So if all goes well, and with some assumptions, and nothing crazy is happening during the passage, you can pretty much say that post-treatment, that is the causal effect. The difference between the two now is the causal effect. And so I think in this paper, it was like a difference of per capita consumption was like 30 packs was attributed to the tax. 30 less packs per capita. So that's kind of what we're doing here because we have this, this issue of the pre-existing trends. So this is kind of our setup. We have 6 case studies now. We see that the minimum wage growth is very different, as you saw in the pictures, what we're evaluating. The pre-periods are different because these are all kind of being phased in at different rates, at different time periods. And then we have to come up with a donor pool. Again, we're using the QCEW, this is county level data. We're working with the states and or local officials to extract the city data from the QCEW county data, right? And then we're trying to build a donor pool based on, you need a clean donor pool. So like in the cigarette tax, there were no other taxes. If you had a state that were also passing taxes, that would really kind of mess up the donor pool, right? You need a clean donor pool so you can get this causal effect. So this is kind of our setup. We're using earnings. Earnings here these are aggregate data by industry. We're looking at a lot of industries, but I'm going to show you now the food, service, and drinking places industry. It's a very highly affected industry. And earnings are simply average weekly earnings, but it's aggregate. It's simply all of the earnings in that sector divided by the number of workers in that sector and divided by 13 to get an average weekly wage. So it's just an average weekly wage per worker without accounting for any hours, right? And then we also have employment, which is just total employment. And we have some other restrictions that we're kind of playing around with, the population being 200K because we're looking at pretty big cities here, similar minimum wage changes, which we're probably going to relax some of that assumption. But if San Francisco, like you saw in the chart, was indexing, so then we were only including in the donor pool the possible donors would also be indexing, for instance. And then if there's no increases to get in the donor pool, you can't be having any increases in your minimum wage to keep it clean. So what does that mean? That means that because you can now not have any county data that are in states that have minimum wages that are changing, and there are a lot of states that are changing. And you can't have a county that has within the county a city that has a citywide minimum wage that are changing, right? So what does it leave us with? Again, like Aaron pointed out, these are not random policies. It leaves us with a lot of southern states, right? And we know that it's this policy is not random. It's probably not going to hurt us for our estimation, but it may overstate our significance levels that we're trying to calculate, which I'll talk about in a minute. And we know that even in the South, again, there's almost no chance that they're going to have a local minimum wage, and the places that are being rolled back. So there's state preemption laws, for instance, in Kentucky, actually rolled back minimum wages that were not only passed, but were already phasing in. They were already in effect for Lexington and Louisville, Kentucky, and they rolled them back. They did the same thing for St. Louis, Missouri. So that's our donor pool for Chicago. This is our donor pool for Oakland, San Jose, and DC. And this is the donor pool for San Francisco and Seattle. So what I'm going to show you is, again, just for some preliminary data for the food services and drinking places. And this here is now the difference between the city, the real city, and its synthetic, right? So from the tobacco pictures, from you want them to match. That's what the computer is doing when it's generating the synthetic, right? Generating the synthetic match. So the difference should be hovering around 0, right? And that's what we see here. We see a pretty tight, band, a narrow band there around 0. So what happens is then when you have the policy that gets enacted, and they're all centered now at time 0, even though they're all really being done at different times. They're all the results are centered around time 0. You see that we do see this earnings effect, right? I mean, it looks pretty impressive, right? So. I'm going to show you kind of significance here in a minute, but those are the earnings results. And here's then for employment, it doesn't look quite as good. The match doesn't look quite as good in the pre-period. This big spike, this big positive spike for Oakland, I mean, we certainly don't think that's causal to the minimum wage. Again, you have to a little bit be worried about other things that are happening around the time that Oakland instituted its minimum wage. We started booming here in the restaurant industry. For those of you who don't know, Oaktown is now like the place for foodies, not across the bay. But without that, we were pretty much hovered around 0 even after the effect, right? So what we do is, so here's what it all looks like. I mean, with all the statistics and what makes it look good. The good news is that the mean effect for the donor pool. So how do we get these? So here's the effect. These are just the coefficients, right, for each individual run. Then we see that the p-values, those are, they have to be like below 0.05 to be significant. So 3 of them are significant and the other ones aren't. In employment, that's not the case. None of them are significant. The donor pool size is here. The pre-increase periods are fairly short. I mean, what is long enough is not really known, but it's certainly less than infinity. But what we do to get these p-values are that we do these placebo tests, right? Where you take every every county in the donor pool and you give it the minimum wage increase. You treat it as if it actually got the minimum wage increase, right? And you see what happens, because that should just be random variation. And what you hope is what we estimated for the real treated unit is somehow towards the outer bounds of all of that random noise. So that's we're taking the ratio of the mean squared predicted error in the pre-period over the post-period to figure this out, right? And then we just kind of rank them. But it's not working so well. I mean, look, some of these confidence intervals, we can't rule anything out, right? Again, we only have 6 cities, but we can pull them. So if we pull them, and on the axis we have the size of the minimum wage increase, and over there we plot it against the actual coefficient that we found, and we see we have this really nice tight regression line. The slope of the regression line now is kind of the pooled effect, which is 0.25, which is right in what we found in the literature for a very long time. We don't know if that's just lucky or if this is what we found, but this is a pretty nice and pretty tight confidence interval, and it's significant at the 95th percentile, right? So it kind of falls apart a little bit with employment. Again, we had that, remember Oakland was kind of an outlier, so if you took out Oakland, it's pretty flat, right at 0. And but it's not, we don't have this nice tight, band of these effects around this linear regression line. So I think and again, we can't rule anything out. We have this, even with the pooled estimate here, we have we can't rule out big negative, big positive, or 0 effect here. So that's, we need to do more work. Maybe when we get more cities on board, we get up-to-date data, maybe we'll be able to figure this out. So there's certainly more work to be done. We're kind of stepping back, and we're going to do a pooled difference in difference regression. Well, I shouldn't say Carl's going to do that. And we're going to run some, covariates, and we're going to do some testing, which we've already done some testing, but I didn't show any today. For instance, we tested professional and technical services because you shouldn't see an effect there, so that's a good falsification test. We're going to look at other affected industries, such as retail trade, food and beverage, nursing home. We've been talking to Aaron and our friends about how we can improve on this, maybe relaxing the donor pool to get a larger donor pool that might help us get some tighter inference. So that's where we're going, and we hope to have a report out in early 2018. Thank you.
Thanks again for having us all here and having me here. It's definitely a privilege. I want to present some joint work that's been done by Durek Cengiz at the University of Massachusetts, Arindrajit Dube, who spoke earlier, also at the University of Massachusetts, Attila Lender at the University College London, and I'm Ben Zipperer. I'm at the Economic Policy Institute. And what we're doing is trying to estimate the effect of the minimum wage on total low-wage employment, and we're proposing a new technique to do that we're calling a bunching estimator that's based on work that Attila and others have done, also work that people have done in other fields outside the minimum wage research. So the motivation here is that, like Aaron described earlier, much of the minimum wage research is outcomes studied are typically employment and wages, and those are typically studied for specific subgroups of the population, with the idea being that you actually want to study some portion of the population where minimum wages tend to bind, where most workers are, or many workers are earning minimum wages, rather than looking at parts of the population where there aren't many minimum wage workers, because you expect the effects of the minimum wage to be concentrated on those low wage workers. So there's a lot of research on specific demographic groups like teenagers, or workers with lower education levels, because those tend to have a lot of minimum wage workers, or there's work on specific industries that employ a lot of minimum wage labor, like restaurants, retail. There's also a series of literature that follows workers over time, that looks at workers who are earning low wages before a minimum wage increase, and then follows them over time and sees what happens to their employment and their wage trajectory. So those are incumbent workers, workers that already have a job. And Aaron talked about a lot of lessons from this research, so I won't go over that. But an important kind of, even though we've learned a lot, both about the effects of the minimum wage and about how labor markets actually work, especially the low-wage labor market, there are some important qualifications to that in that we are only typically studying, or at least most of the literature is studying specific subgroups, and we may be afraid that we're missing or painting only a partial picture or characterization of what happens to low-wage workforce as a whole as a response to minimum wage increase. An example being, for example, you may study restaurants, and as Aaron described, there seems to be a kind of a near consensus of findings in the research literature that the average effect of the minimum wage on employment in restaurants is very small or close to zero. However, we may be concerned that restaurants, for example, are substituting away from low-skilled workers towards higher-skilled workers, and we're kind of missing that effect when we look at restaurant overall employment. Similarly, we may be concerned that when we're following low-wage workers over time, when we look at the effect of the minimum wage on incumbent workers, workers who already have a job, we may be missing the effect of the minimum wage of drawing new workers into the workforce. So there are a variety of ways that studying specific subgroups can be very helpful, but we may be missing the big picture when we're talking about low-wage workforce as a whole. So our paper tries to overcome these challenges. And what it does is it estimates the effect of the minimum wage on the entire wage distribution. And specifically we're going to focus on the bottom of the wage distribution, looking at low-wage workers, and we're going to leverage the fact that at the bottom of the wage distribution, an observed fact of the real world and also what you would expect from a lot of economic theory is that workers tend to bunch around the minimum wage. There are a lot of workers working at or near the minimum wage, and we're going to use that fact along with minimum wage changes to estimate a total employment effect for low-wage workers as a whole. I'll explain how we do that, but just to give a sense of what we find. We find that for the entire low-wage workforce, the employment effects of minimum wages in our sample of minimum wage events that we're studying are close to zero. They're small and they're not statistically different from zero, but they are sufficiently statistically precise to rule out sizable or larger negative effects that have been published in this research. We also find that the minimum wage for the events that we're studying really binds. It really creates a distributional change in jobs, and it increases the average wage for affected low-wage workers, in our case by about 7%. We also find that there doesn't seem to be about a lot of substitution away from low-skilled towards higher-skilled workers in response to a minimum wage increase, like I was talking about earlier with restaurants. We don't find any of that labor-labor substitution. We also find some very interesting results about spillovers of the minimum wage to the rest of the wage distribution. So when you raise the minimum wage, you directly affect workers. Employers are mandated to pay a certain wage or above. And those workers who are brought up to the new minimum wage, they receive a direct wage increase. But we also see in the data and in our results a wage spillover effect where workers earning just above the new minimum wage also see a wage increase. So we find very clear evidence of that. We also find that these spillover effects are somewhat limited in the sense that they tend to taper off and die out about $3 above the new minimum wage. Moreover, we find that these spillover effects are concentrated mostly on incumbent workers, workers who already have a job, and that there are limited to no spillover effects for new entrants into the labor force, into employment. So how are we going to do this? So imagine a wage distribution for the entire economy in an economy that does not have a minimum wage. So this is just purely hypothetical. You would get a picture that sort of looks like this. So the idea is that you calculate everybody's hourly wage, you line them all up, you count the number of people that are earning certain wage levels, and you would get this kind of picture where the horizontal axis is the wage level, the vertical axis is the vertical axis is the number of workers. And this is an economy hypothetically, this is what an economy would look like without a minimum wage. Now introduce a minimum wage. So that's the red line, without a minimum wage. The blue line is with a minimum wage. So employers are mandated to pay at least wages above the wage floor, above the minimum wage. And so you're going to see, as we do in the data, a bunching of workers at or near the minimum wage. So that's what that blue line is. And you also see gaps, accordingly, between the red and the blue lines, right? So after the minimum wage increase, the blue line comes into existence and shifts the wage distribution somewhat. And if you take the difference between the blue and the red line below the new minimum wage, those are the missing jobs, the jobs that we no longer see, that no longer exist at those wage levels. So those are the missing jobs as a result of the minimum wage increase. You can look at the difference between the blue and the red lines above the new minimum wage. That's the excess jobs above the new minimum wage that are created as a result of the increase in the minimum wage. So, and you'll also see that if you go far enough to the right-hand side on the wage distribution, there's very little difference between the blue and the red lines. They basically overlap because we expect and we confirm empirically that there's very little change in wages well into the upper tail of the wage distribution. So the total employment effect for low-wage workers is we just sum these changes. We take the negative change, the negative red change, the jobs that we no longer see, plus the positive blue change, the additional jobs that we see as a result of the minimum wage. We add them together, and that's the total employment effect for low-wage workers. Now, we can do this with actual real data. That was hypothetical. So we'll do this with real data. And the simplest way to think about this is, again, just a single case of a single minimum wage increase. In this case is Washington State in 1999 to 2000, where Washington State passed a relatively large minimum wage increase. In real terms, it went from about, inflation-adjusted terms, it went from about $7 an hour to $9 an hour. And they actually indexed that minimum wage to inflation. So this was a large permanent increase in the minimum wage at that time in Washington. The blue bars are what Washington's wage distribution looked like after the minimum wage increase. And as you can see, there's a spike of workers earning about $9 an hour. So that's the new minimum wage. And you can see very few workers in Washington earning less than $9 an hour after that new minimum wage increase. The red bars are what we think Washington would have looked like, counterfactual Washington. Washington would have looked like had it not passed that minimum wage increase. So what Washington looked like after the minimum wage increase, had it not passed that minimum wage increase. And the way that we're constructing this counterfactual Washington is we're looking at all the other states during this time period that did not pass minimum wage increases and using their wage distributions plus Washington's, the change in their wage distributions plus Washington's old wage distribution to come up with a counterfactual Washington. You can take the difference between these bars and you'll calculate the employment effects of the minimum wage in Washington at that time. So this is just the difference between those blue and red bars, the bars on this screen. The red line here is just summing up those changes as summing them up across the wage distribution. And what we find for Washington is we find actually a positive affected employment change of about 6% for affected low-wage workers and a wage change, a positive wage change, about 9%. That's what we find for Washington, but we don't have to limit ourselves to Washington. We can actually look at a whole bunch of state-level minimum wage increases. We're going to look at 138 state-level minimum wage increases over the last 38 years. We're going to exclude some small increases, exclude federal increases because it's difficult to come up with control areas for that. And we're going to examine changes in missing jobs, excess jobs, total employment change, and the total wage changes for up to 5 years after a minimum wage increase. And when we do that, we get a very similar picture as we did for Washington. You see a very clear bite to the minimum wage, a very sharp distributional change in the number of jobs around the new minimum wage. So you have a destruction of jobs below and an increase of jobs above, and the red line adds them up across the wage distribution. The other thing that you can find that's a little hard to see, but just above that new minimum wage, you see some wage increases. And those are the spillovers that are accruing to workers just above the new minimum wage. We can also do this kind of finding, we can also do this procedure not for the entire low-wage labor market, but for specific subgroups. So here, what we're plotting are on the horizontal axis are the missing jobs below the new minimum wage, and on the vertical axis, the excess jobs above the new minimum wage. And for different demographic groups like women, Black and Hispanic workers, workers with lower education, teenagers. And what we find is that the missing jobs and the excess jobs tend to offset each other so that there's very little change in aggregate employment for those low-wage workers. We can additionally break that out by education and break out these demographic subgroups by education and age to get a sense of whether employers are substituting away from low-skilled workers toward high-skilled workers. We don't find any of that substitution, with most of our estimates kind of clumped around a line where the changes in excess and missing jobs kind of offset each other. Additionally, we can, like I was mentioning earlier, we can look at incumbents and new entrants. So the data that we're using is current population survey data, and in that data, respondents are re-interviewed after a year, and so we can assess, we can partition the data that we're looking at into workers who were working the prior year and workers who were not working the prior year. So we have incumbent workers who were working and new entrant workers who were not working the prior year. And what we find is we find a somewhat larger bite for incumbents than we do for new entrants. There's a larger distributional change around the new minimum wage. We also find a larger wage increase for those incumbents. The wage increase for affected incumbents is about 9.5%, as opposed to new entrants, it's about 1.9%. And for both cases, we find a total total employment effect of pretty close to zero. So this is the effect, the same sort of picture for incumbent workers, workers who were working the prior year. You can see a large distributional change right around the new minimum wage increase, and you also see spillover effects going up to about $3 above the new minimum wage. For new entrants, this is on the same scale, we see a much smaller change around the minimum wage increase. And we also see just above the new minimum wage, we don't see any evidence of a spillover effect. So new entrants aren't the total wage spillover effect seems to be accruing entirely to incumbent workers. I'm almost out of time. This is perfect. So there's increasing interest in understanding the total employment effect on low-wage workers as a whole, not just for specific subgroups, and our new approach does that. And in particular, we find employment effects that are more positive in general than some of the notable effects in this kind of literature. In particular, we find a total employment effect for low-wage workers of about, for a 10% minimum wage increase, we find a 0.24 a positive employment effect. That is not statistically different from zero, but the confidence interval around that is statistically precise enough that we can say that it is statistically more positive than some other estimates, such as papers by Muir and West and Clemens and Wither. Additionally, because our approach is a case study-based approach, even though I was presenting evidence that for pooled case studies effectively, this case study approach can be potentially very useful to study specific wage increases or multiple wage increases that are happening as we speak. In our sample of minimum wage increases, the share of workers below the new minimum wage was something like 9%. In California and New York, that share is going to be, definitely going to exceed 20%. So researchers can actually use this approach to evaluate, and will use this approach to evaluate specific minimum wage increases, and also it can be adopted to, because it is a case study-based approach, it can be adopted to assess whether these employment effects and wage effects differ depending on the size of the increase. Thank you.
Actually,
actually, I'll just start, since I'm the discussant. I know there aren't any questions here, but I get to ask a clarifying question because I want to discuss Ben's work. So on the Washington, I just want to ask, was that the same data, the CPS, or you're using administrative data?
Yeah, so
right?
I didn't go over that. So it's a mixture of CPS data. In that picture, it was
Right.
a mixture of CPS data and administrative data that
Yeah.
we were able to obtain from
Okay.
Washington State.
Okay, that's what I thought. So I want to react to some of the new things that you said that I guess are relatively new. And I was asked to do a brief discussion that's sort of motivated by what's been said so far. I just want to start by saying that, CWED has, the papers that come out of here are very heavily cited, and they tend to have 4 co-authors, so we need to learn these acronyms. So this is AGNR and CDLZ, and those are great. The hard part is trying to remember which one is which, right? But so just to recap, we've seen that a lot of the work that's been done, including these 2 papers that were just presented, has addressed some of the key questions in the minimum wage literature, in particular the literature that tries to measure employment effects of minimum wages. So I just want to recap what some of those key issues are. The first is, how do we choose the right control group? So when we're comparing employment trends of workers who got a minimum wage increase to workers that didn't get a minimum wage increase, the key assumption to be able to interpret those differences as a causal effect is that the trends in those the employment trends would have been parallel in the absence of the minimum wage increase. In other words, we want to be sure we're comparing apples to apples. But the way to do that is not always the same in every circumstance. So the second question is, how do we identify the workers that were treated that got the minimum wage increase? And as both Aaron and Ben have talked about, most of the past research has focused on using a proxy like demographic groups, teenagers, or the industry where the worker is employed as a proxy for being a minimum wage worker. And there are 2 drawbacks to this. The one is that, well, if you're just focusing on teenagers or on one sector, you're missing a lot of the workers we really care about, especially adults. And the effects for adults might actually be different from the effects for teenagers. Some of my work has shown that the effects differ for adults and teenagers. So it's too exclusive in a way. But also, these approaches are too inclusive in that if you're looking at everyone in an industry, you're including a lot of workers who didn't get minimum wage increases. And the danger there is that largely that you lose precision because you're including a lot of these workers that are not treated in the estimate. The third issue that has been talked about some is, how do we address spillover effects? And there are various types of spillover effects, but generally I mean, when some workers get a minimum wage increase, are other workers affected by that? Workers who weren't directly affected by the increase. And we need to be concerned about spillover effects on employment. So one example is labor substitution. So when minimum wage workers get higher wages, does that mean that their labor is substituted with higher skilled, higher wage workers higher skilled workers could be affected in that sense. There's potentially geographic spillovers, and this is particularly important when we're thinking about local minimum wages. So this is an issue that's kind of new with these local minimum wages. How do we think about the effects of very local changes? And the fact that when a city raises a minimum wage, we might be concerned that jobs leave the city to surrounding areas suggests that we need to think really carefully about the proper control group. Again, it's not clear that you just want to look at surrounding cities. The assumption might be, well, close by cities and counties might be the most comparable, but not necessarily. And part of the reason is that there could be spillover effects. Then third, and I'm glad that Ben really emphasized this point in his talk, is that there could be spillover effects on wages. So some workers are directly affected, others are indirectly affected. And this could be, so workers who are already earning slightly above the minimum could get raises. Why? This could be because employers use the minimum wage as a benchmark. It could be that they want to preserve the internal wage structure, and I think I'll come back to this a second. There's some evidence in what Ben presented that this is part of what's going on. And so these being the big issues, I just want to say briefly that the work we've seen not only thinks about these issues very carefully and thinks about the correct and most rigorous and credible way to address each one of these issues, thinks about the fact that the best way to address it might differ with the question and differ with the context and the data at hand. But also that there tends to be this trade-off in all applied microeconomics between rigor and credibility on the one hand and transparency and simplicity on the other hand. And I think the other thing I would say about this collection of work is that it's done a great job of doing that balancing act, applying very rigorous approaches and then synthesizing the results into what I would call tweetable slides and graphs that so working at the Council of Economic Advisors, I'd never done a tweet in my life, but I came to appreciate the power of a tweet. I appreciate it even more, but I'll say that I hope that there will soon, again, one day be a time when the White House is looking for tweets that synthesize credible research and in a very nice, transparent way. And when that day comes, these slides will be ready to go. So things like this, just like, okay, we want to see that the trends are parallel leading up to the policy change. So I want to say, with the few minutes I have left, I just want to say a bit more about the bunching estimator. As Ben already summarized some of the advantages of it, it's nice because it focuses on the treated workers as precisely as possible. Instead of saying, let's use industry or age as a proxy for treated workers, let's just look at the changes in employment for all workers who could plausibly have been affected by the minimum wage, all workers below some wage cutoff. And that allows for a couple things. It allows the estimates to be more precise. And it also, because teenagers aren't being used as a proxy for minimum wage workers, it allows for comparisons of the effects for different groups of workers who were actually affected. So teenagers versus adults, workers in different industries. And I really like that. But what I like most, partly because it's really new and there's really little evidence on this in existing literature, is the fact that they're able to say something about wage spillovers. And again, when I was at the CEA, I could have talked on and on about all the methods for addressing bias and estimating employment effects, but what policymakers I learned really wanted to know was, let's assume there are no employment effects. How many workers would get a raise if we raise the minimum wage? And so I said, well, it's easy to count the number of workers out there who are making the minimum wage or less. But I really can't answer that question because there are workers who might, who are making more than the minimum who could also get a raise. And it turns out, this is an important question, even when you're trying to estimate the employment effects. So the CBO, for example, made assumptions about the wage spillover effect. And as far as I can tell, this is the one number that this is kind of, well, we don't really know, so we're just going to guess. And there's not a lot of good evidence. The evidence that does exist, there are a couple of papers by, I'm not sure you mentioned them in the talk, but certainly in the paper, by David Lee and Otter Smith and Manning, who've used the CPS data to try to look at whether there's evidence consistent with wage spillovers. And they did find evidence consistent with wage spillovers. In other words, the minimum wage goes up. You see bunching at the minimum, but also a little bit above the minimum, just like it was seen here. But there were two problems with that. And in their work, their conclusion was, we don't really know because, one, when you see a shift in the wage distribution and some higher wage workers also get bumps, this could be because of employment changes. So there could be disemployment among lower wage workers and more employment among higher wage workers. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that there is measurement error in the CPS data. So if you see this, the bunching shift to the right, and you also see some of the spillover shift to the right, you see bunching at the new higher minimum wage and also a little bit above it. That could be explained by the fact that all workers are now at the new minimum wage, but there's also some measurement error, and some are reporting slightly higher wages. Okay, so these are the two issues in the past, and this method first addresses the first issue by looking jointly at employment and wages. So to the extent you can look at all low-wage workers and say no employment changes, then you can say, okay, let's look at the effect on the distribution of wages, and that can't be due to employment changes. The second thing that the new evidence I just saw now is able to do is partly address the measurement error issue. And what I took away from those two slides was the slides based on the Washington state data looked very similar to the slides based on the CPS. And that suggests to me that it's not just measurement error, because the Washington data is actually administrative data. And so I really like that you're going a long way towards solving those two problems and answering an important question that hasn't been answered before. And I'll just end with, these are a couple of slides from 8 years ago. I was asked to discuss this paper by Otter, Manning, and Smith that I mentioned that tried to look at spillover effects, and they brought up these two issues. And I happened to have this personnel data that I had been working with Jonathan Leonard and David Levine, and recently I've been working with Aaron to look at a bunch of different things. But we have wage data from a large US retail employer with many hundreds of firms throughout the US, lots of low-wage workers. And the data spans the period that covers the 1996 federal minimum wage increase when the federal minimum went from $425 to $475. And this is just a histogram of entry-level wages on the day before the minimum wage increase. Minimum wage was $425. You can see actually there's bunching at $5, not $425. So that's the first interesting thing. But the day after, I just love going back and forth between these two graphs. I see this jump. The day after, you do clearly see spillovers. The distribution shifts to the right. And now there's a new big spike at $525. So this bunch moves up. I argued at the time, I said, well, okay, so this is just a case study, one case, but it's no measurement error, no employment effects. There's something going on. There are wage spillovers. And it's important to try to use a combination of administrative data with the CPS and thinking about all the different mechanisms that can be going on here to try to understand this. And I'll end by saying the way you broke out the incumbent workers versus the new workers is also really nice, because it suggests that because the spillover effect was mainly concentrated among incumbent workers, it suggests that there's internal wage structures are important, that the existing workers get a bump when their workers who are earning the minimum wage below them get one. So I find all that very promising, and I look forward to seeing what comes next. Thanks.
Okay. So first of all, I just want to start out and say I've been reading kind of a few books on like cosmology and astronomy, and there's all this debate about kind of parallel universes, and are we ever going to be discover them? And I don't want to take any shots at any of our other friends here on the campus, but I think that kind of some of these work that everyone here has done on kind of coursing these different states and localities into parallel trends is kind of represents kind of a win for the economists over the physicists, and kind of discovering parallel universes in a sense. I think everything that we've talked about today is a way of looking at that. So I know that there's kind of a rivalry between economists and physicists, and I think that we should consider this a win. Having said that, my research, and it's kind of, I've been looking at things at a bit of a kind of higher level, trying to compare states and kind of the different policy regimes that states use. And this is always kind of a tricky question to answer. I'm sure kind of at any election you hear former governors and things like that say, hey, when I was in office, I created millions and millions of jobs, and all of us kind of roll our eyes and say, no, you didn't. That probably would have happened anyways. And California over the past kind of 5 years has done, 5 or 6 years, has done a lot of progressive economic policy. It's instituted higher minimum wages, done a huge implementation of the Affordable Care Act that kind of outpaces kind of any other state, raised taxes on wealthy and corporations, and done a lot of work on climate change. And there's always kind of the big question of, well, so we've done all of this, what does that mean for our economy? And we know from kind of some of the work that we've talked about before here, we know the effects of some of these policies individually. So we kind of have a good sense that, modest increases in the minimum wage don't have employment effects. But we don't know, what if you raise the minimum wage and you also implement paid sick leave, and you also implement the ACA, and you also institute a cap and trade system? when you do all these things, what's kind of happened to the state economy? Is there kind of some cumulative effect here? And the nice thing about kind of all of these research methods are they kind of lend themselves to answering that question at the state level. So a lot of people have kind of noticed that California's been doing all these things, and kind of as the slide showed, noticed that California has also been doing a bit better economically than states under Republican control. Kind of when I first presented this at the meeting of our advisory board, which is kind of a fairly lay audience, I like to think kind of even based on some of the work that the folks here have done in exposing the problems of you need a good control group. A lot of people kind of, before I could even get to my next slides, jumped up and said, but hey, California, you can't compare them to Republican states like Texas or Idaho. What are you going to do about that? And that's kind of where a lot of this work kind of with the synthetic control method has come in. And it's made kind of a comparison between California, which we think looks very different than any other state kind of in this country, possible, where you can kind of actually take a look at what California's done and get a credible estimate of what California might have looked like had it not. So in my work, this is kind of California unemployment and the synthetic California that hadn't done all the things that it's done over the past few years. And kind of using other methods, it'd be really tough to get that kind of nice parallel kind of trend situation before these policies went into effect. And the power of kind of these methods is that now I can create a California that hasn't done these things. And we can see that they match kind of well early on, and then as soon as some of these policies kick in, there really is a divergence. Now it's tough I think some of us have mentioned, it's tough with these methods to get kind of the tight confidence intervals that we like, to say very kind of specific things about it, but it certainly suggests that a lot of the kind of negative kind of effects that people talk about when these things are debated don't seem to be coming true. And I think that this is a big step forward in kind of the broader kind of economic philosophy debates, and kind of shifting that burden of proof from kind of people on a more progressive side to those who are kind of using the traditional arguments that kind of doing anything good for low-wage workers, good for the environment, generally just good for people is gonna kill jobs and hurt the economy. The other thing that we kind of realized with this work was that explaining these synthetic control models to the public is pretty tricky. And so, kind of my thought from the outset was, once you show a graph like this, it's fine. People will get it. You have the lines that match and then diverge. Turns out that that's kind of not as easy to convince people of. But I think that that's an area where I actually do think that kind of this kind of the parallel trends, the emphasis on that and kind of this research has really makes kind of convincing people that a bit easier, because then you can show a picture like this where you say, look, these two things, they are the same. They are very similar beforehand, and they are kind of operating the same, and then we change kind of this, well, hopefully just one thing, but maybe not always. And then we kind of can actually see the effect there. And it gets out of like the complicated, math of how did we compute this weighted average of 50 states and, pick them out. And so that's kind of one of, I think, really the nice things about, this method that kind of we were talking about before, is that the pictures that come out of it are pretty nice and convincing and relatively easy to understand. We actually even managed to make a YouTube video that's kind of animated and has some great great pictures and video along with it to kind of walk people through it. And I was surprised. I was kind of nervous when this came out, and then started to hear from my parents and things like that. They were like, "Hey, that synthetic control method, it's pretty that's pretty good." And it turns out that it is something that people can kind of understand, and I think that's a big step forward in kind of the credibility of these arguments. So I don't think I have much more to add, so I'll open it up.
Hey, thanks everybody for the great research presentations and the discussion. Ben, I think this is a very simple question, but can you explain, when you talk about the difference in the wage growth that you observe, earnings increases that you observe for incumbent workers versus new entrants, can you talk about how you're measuring that for new entrants, since presumably you don't have a base wage for them unless you have their reservation wage or something?
Right. So the advantage of our approach is that we are able to overcome this challenge of the fact that workers who are new entrants weren't working in the prior period, because what we're doing is it's very simple, but it makes it very nice in that way that it's very transparent, that we simply just count the number of jobs at each wage bin. So we're looking at specific wage bins, 25-cent wage bins. Count the number of workers in each wage bin in a given state at a given time period. And we can calculate those counts for workers who are incumbents, and we can also calculate those counts for workers who are new entrants, even though they weren't earning a wage in the prior period. And so we aren't following, maybe this gets at your question, we're not following new entrants from their prior state. We just know that somebody is a new entrant. And so we look at the change in the counts of new entrants. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question to that. What happens if you look just at incumbent workers to the employment effect?
Right. So one slide, if I think I understand your question correctly, one slide that we showed, the effects on incumbent workers in general, in terms of the distributional changes, are a bit larger than for new entrants. And what we find for the total effect on incumbent workers, the total employment effect on low-wage incumbent workers, that is relatively close to zero, just as it is for new entrants. The difference between those groups qualitatively and quantitatively in our findings is that we find bigger wage changes for incumbents, and also we find larger wage spillover changes for incumbents. But the total employment effect for incumbent low-wage workers and new entrant low-wage workers is relatively similar.
I have a quick question for each panelist, and I'll be very brief. Aaron, regarding the Newmark-Washer criticism that you don't have to worry about parallel trends, I don't get why simply statistical significance of those trends isn't dispositive, doesn't just answer that. As I recall in your work, those trends are significant, ergo, when I read that, I thought you were right and he was wrong, but maybe I'm missing something simple. I have a feeling I am. And Sylvia, when you were presenting your findings, whenever you got to the employment findings, I was confused by your language, because you sort of said, well, it all sort of blows up here and we don't get what's going on. But it just looked like there wasn't much in terms of employment effects, which seemed consistent with everything else. So I wondered why that was such a head scratcher for you. And then third, Ben, I think you said in future research you're going to look at this, but it strikes me that there's no reason why in your current work you couldn't look at the differences in these outcomes conditional on the size of the minimum wage changes, and I think that'd be really interesting. And by the way, I was just absolutely blown away by what I heard this morning. I think this is just the cutting edge of great research, so thank you. It's great to get out of the swamp and actually hear people thinking about this stuff so deeply.
Okay, I'll take the question first. I agree with you. I wrote a paper calculating those standard errors and finding that there's very clear pre-existing trends. I think the criticism has to do with some details of the way our original paper had calculated those leads. And I think what I showed you is the paper with Michael, Ben, and Sylvia, where we actually did exactly what I showed you. And it was, I think, in my view, pretty clear evidence that for teen employment, there are huge pre-existing trends. I don't know what else to say except that that seems pretty clear to me.
Yeah, everything's a head scratcher for me. Well, I mean, the thing we would like to have is a little more, precision, right? We don't get any negative effects. It doesn't look like it. It certainly looks like it's hovering around 0. The point estimate was a small positive. So, we're just trying to be cautious and not kind of overplay it.
I think that's an excellent point. That's something we're actively doing, actually, in the next version of our paper. Shows how, or may show how, minimum wage effects vary depending on the bite of the minimum wage increase.
Yeah, it'll show, and
Yeah.
and you'll have the paper will be out next month. So.
So Ben, I'm trying to understand what you're saying for the new entrants. So the new entrants clearly get a raise because the previous new entrants could be paid a lower wage. So are you saying that you get this super bunching because you're saying there are no other effects? So you just get this super bunching, they're all bunched at the new minimum. You don't see anything else. And second, I'm not sure I would necessarily see the same kind of ripple effect. So is it that it's all bunched, which would mean there is no effect, or there's bunching and now I see some people at higher wages than I would have seen before? That's what I'm trying to get straight. So I mean, my own work would suggest that you should see some people in jobs you didn't see before. And sometimes it's hard to tell whether it's a ripple effect or whether they are now on a different path. So I get a different kind of job. It may not pay a significant amount more, but I'm actually on a different path. I'm going to be doing something different.
Right. So I think I can answer some of your questions. So what we find is that we don't find a change in the number of jobs for new entrant workers much above or directly above the minimum wage, the new minimum wage. So we find that the effects on the change in the number of new entrant jobs is really concentrated just at that new minimum wage, just below and just at that minimum wage, as opposed to incumbent workers where we see a kind of a wage spillover effect extending just beyond the new minimum wage. We are looking at a time period of, basically up to 5 years after inclusive of the minimum wage effect. So we are capturing some kind of short to medium term effects. So if that there are delayed spillover effects, as you might expect that there would be under some circumstances, we're still not seeing that, at least for new entrants, though we are seeing it for incumbents.
Any other questions on spillover? Well, I have one, which is the idea of why spillovers would exist has to do both with relationships within a firm, like maintaining some wage parities between a supervisor and the person supervised, and also between firms. And so my curiosity is, when you say incumbent workers, you don't mean necessarily people who stayed within the same firm. But
right, so we're not distinguishing that in our data. But I think that you're right, though those are two, in my view, extremely important potential mechanisms as to why we would see wage spillover effects. So is this like a internal to the firm, which suggests probably something more norm-based, or is it more market-mediated spillover effect that we see across firms or across establishments? And we don't distinguish. It's very difficult to distinguish that in our data.
Yeah, what about Laura? Do you have
Oh, sorry. I wanted to ask, in your slide, you saw a bit of extra spillover at the $3 above the minimum wage, and in the data I showed, which is just one firm, but there's evidence of bunching at wages above the minimum, which suggests that some benchmarking effect, right? We're setting the lowest wage in the firm at some 50 cents above the minimum. Mm-hmm. Is there any way you can use bunching at round numbers to try to get at that, to see whether there's a shift in the modal wage?
You're sort of doing some work along those lines. I don't know if you want to address that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is that my guess is that the reason there's the bunch that you, in your picture that you showed, is because of round number bunching. Right. And there's huge round number bunching in administrative data. So I have a paper with Alan Manning and Suresh Naidu, just shows that there's very significant amount of bunching at those numbers. I think there's an interesting thing that happens when the minimum wage crosses round number. So this is a random point, like the modal wage in the United States in over 45 states in the last 20 years has been $10 an hour nominally, exactly. It's really interesting. I mean, it's a modal wage, and lots of things are different across these states. But so when the minimum wage, I think, crosses a mode that in general has a bigger increase, I think some of the issues of why these, so for example, I think some why firms use these type of bunched wages have to, in my sense, has to do with a variety of administrative and norms type, wage policy type reasons. I don't think we can do that. We can really dig into that using the kind of data we're using for the minimum wage project. However, I think that is something with firm level data, which we hope to use for Oregon, where we have the universe of matched employer-employee data, and these minimum wage increases, I think, will enable us to dig into some of those issues and the spillovers. I do want to say one thing about spillovers. $3 above the minimum wage is, on average, is about the 25th percentile, where it dies out, and which is actually exactly the same as Otter, Manning, and Smith's finding. The difference is that we can show that if you use their way of estimating measurement error using administrative data from 3 states, which we have, you find that the CPS has no more measurement error than these high-quality administrative data, which is very reassuring for our method and reassuring for interpreting the spillovers as being causal and not driven by kind of the cloud of measurement error type of argument.
So I guess this is more to Aaron and Ben, but maybe Sylvia can chime in as well. Just anticipating a little bit what Michael's going to talk about later, if we think that part of what's happening here is you have various effects going on at the same time, prices are going up, which affects the demand for those particular services, but low-wage workers have more money in their pockets and they're spending it in the economy, we should expect, at least as this gets bigger, some of the job growth to be, some industry shift in jobs, potentially, because the money isn't all being spent in the same industries where those workers were. From what you're saying, it sounds like you're not finding evidence of that right now. It looks like it's all pretty much within the same space. And is that because at the wage increases we've seen so far, there's just not enough demand effects to change things, or is that something your model wouldn't pick up because it could be at similar wages within different industries, so we just don't know to what degree we're seeing those effects?
So there's a question about why we don't see that, and that's something that we can't necessarily answer with our data. I mean, one plausible explanation is that, yeah, we're not, the minimum wages that we have studied in this paper, even though there are some sizable ones, aren't large enough to, for example, cause minimum wage effects, outside of employment effects or wage increases outside of the low wage population, because we do confirm with our data that there doesn't seem to be much of a significant, or in terms of like the sheer magnitude, sizable employment or wage effect, once you move at least $3 above the minimum wage.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is really keeps my brain busy. This is really good stuff. Having just come back from spending a number of months in Vietnam, where the workforce looks real different and is heavily skewed toward youth and even teenagers, but certainly younger people, I'm real interested in some of those aspects of your presentations, all of you. So I have two basic questions. One, what is the effective definition that's being used when you say teenagers? Is it below 18 because that's adulthood, or is it the arithmetic teenager, 19 years old and below? Because that matters, because whether it takes in large numbers of college students or not. And the second question is related and also partly carries on with the gentleman back row's question, is what about the unique aspects of teenagers' employment in the sense that they are much more likely to go in and out of the labor force depending on other factors? And what can you say about minimum wage impact on that and on the general statistics that you're assembling? That's sort of a three-part bad question, but you get my point, I think. And if you'd all like to address all of that, I'd appreciate it.
Do you want me to take a stab?
Teens are just those who are under 20. That includes 19, and that's just almost always. It depends. In the one of the data sets, the QWI, it's actually not. I believe it's 18 and below. But in a lot of times that we use the teens, it's just 19, and it's just a convention. It's a terrible convention in my opinion. I participated in promoting it, so I take my responsibility for using that. But on the other hand, if you break it at 18 and below, it doesn't really matter that much in terms of some of these things. But it may in some cases, but at least in a few of the things that I showed, that it didn't really seem to matter very much. But
your point about the high.
Don't you have more to say about why teens aren't very representative?
Oh, well, actually, teens, that's a great point, Michael. So I think here's one thing that I'd like to throw out. I think there's been increasing interest in understanding a broader effects, like Laura, you were saying, and I think the bunching approach, for instance, is one way of getting at that. Because really it captures the effects for low-wage workers in general. Another approach, which I'm also very excited about, my advisee, Doruk Cengiz, also my co-author, has been working in his dissertation to use machine learning tools to identify, and using demographic profiling, who are likely minimum wage workers, and then seeing what happens to employment for those workers. Using even the current population survey, he can identify up to 75% of minimum wage workers, likely minimum wage workers. And it turns out, very interestingly, that he can get it very clear using the same kind of techniques people have used for looking at teen employment effect of minimum wages. You can look at wages, wage effect of this demographically profiled group, or this composite group that captures nearly 3/4 of the workers who are likely to be minimum wage workers. Very clear wage effect. On average, their wages are rising. At the same time, all of the controversies about teens, about what kind of specification should you use trend control or not, turns out it matters much less for this broader group. And employment effects are much more concentrated within a narrower band, which is both encouraging, and it turns out maybe some of those parallel trend problems I showed you were particularly bad for teens because of some of the issues. For instance, how much different states have different amounts of college participation rates and those kind of things. Maybe teens are like the worst place to look in some ways. So I'm very excited about his work. He will be in the job market a year from now, for those of you who might be hiring. So.
Okay. Others want to answer this question?
Especially the second part. Anybody want to have any
I could say one thing. So with the personnel data that I was talking about, I used geographic variation across states, looking at stores in different locations to see how the different stores responded to the federal minimum wage increase. And in that data, I had low-wage workers of different ages and had their exact ages. So was able to break it down by 16 to 17-year-olds, 18 to 19, and so forth. And what I found that was in locations where the minimum wage went up, causing the relative wage of 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds to go up the most. The standard prediction might be that you'd expect substitution away from those young workers and toward older workers. And instead, what I found was a positive employment effect for the youngest teenage workers. Exactly. So one explanation for that is exactly what you were getting at, is that these teenagers don't have much experience with the market. When the minimum wage, they don't know what the posted wage is. When the minimum wage goes up, that draws them into the market. Exactly, yeah.
Other questions? Some time for the panel members to reflect. Start with Aaron. We have a few minutes left.
Oh, there's another question.
Do you have any idea where the work went that was being done by the jobs that are missing? Is that automation, under the table, heteromation, undocumented workers gone overseas, contracted out, part-timed? Any hints about who's doing that work?
Yeah, sure. I mean, why don't you go ahead and answer it?
So on the one hand, we're not following workers over time, so we can't exactly answer that question, but there are some lessons, I think, from our findings that, suggested certain answers. For example, the fact that we're not seeing much labor substitution away from low skilled towards higher skilled workers suggests that establishments are not replacing lower skilled workers with higher skilled workers. That gets at part of your answer.
I just would like to add to that. I mean, it's important to be clear about what we mean by missing jobs. They're not the jobs are not actually disappearing in a real sense. It's a statistical sense in which they're disappearing, in that they're no longer paying low wages. So if a job simply pays a higher wage, it's counted as a missing job that's paying in terms of under the minimum wage. Let's say it goes from $8 to $10, right? So the minimum wage is, let's say, $10 an hour. Now there's no longer that $8 job because it's paying $10 an hour. So the short answer to your question is most likely they're not going anywhere. They're just paying higher wage.